I'm sure you've all heard claims of media bias. Some of you have probably even heard that the news stations lie. And those of you that strongly identify on one side of the fence or the other, as Democrat or as Republican, might even believe that one type of news organization is more guilty of it than the other. So before I move any further, I want to do just a little overview of the different news stations and what kind of values they tend to stand for. So Fox News tends to lean to the right, which means they tend to be supported by Republicans. And another term for this, of course, is conservative. All right, so Fox News is typically considered a Republican, a conservative, a right-leaning news station. On the other hand, CNN, MSNBC, and pretty much most of the other news organizations, they tend to lean to the left, which means they tend to be liberal, which means they tend to be supported by Democrats. All right, so just quick overview. Fox News tends to be Republican, and pretty much most of the other news stations tend to be Democrat. So is there media bias, and do the news stations lie? First, the issue of bias. Is there bias? Absolutely. There's absolutely media bias. Do the news stations lie? Not really, because the thing is there are laws and safeguards that prevent the news stations from doing that. If somebody told a flat-out lie, the person that told it, the reporter or the anchor, as well as the news station itself, would have severe penalties for it, essentially. That the anchor or the reporter would probably get fired. The news organization would be assigned some sort of fine. So they're really careful not to lie. There have been a few instances where people have lied in the past or done false reporting. And if it was intentional false reporting, there were severe penalties. People lost their jobs. News organizations were fined. So they don't lie, really. But they do capitalize on something they know very much about the American public. And I'm guilty of this as well as many of you. It's that we take our news in snippets and we don't really do our homework. We just absorb the information coming in, and we often don't spend the time to really research the deeper issue. So I'm going to give you an example of this. A few years ago, we as a country were debating the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. It is in fact a law now. Obama passed it with his Congress, so it is a law. But in the period of time, it was several years where we were debating whether this was something that we wanted to do as a country. Depending on what news station you watched, you were getting different information. So if you were watching Fox News, remember Fox News leans to the right. If you were watching Fox News, for example, you were frequently presented with this statistic. 90% of Americans have access to health care. Now let me ask you this just for a moment. If you were asked whether it was worth it as a country to pass the Affordable Care Act, which was going to cost billions of dollars a year, and remember, the government doesn't just print their own money. The government's money comes from taxes. So when we're implementing something that's that costly, you have to think about how it's going to affect your pocket. So the Affordable Care Act was potentially going to add taxes, additional tax dollars to the American people, in addition to potentially increasing our national debt, which is already trillions of dollars. It's completely out of hand. So if you were asked whether you supported something like that, whether you wanted to pass the Affordable Care Act, knowing how costly it was potentially going to be, and the fact you were using to make that decision was that 90% of Americans have access to health care, is that something you would have supported? Right, for a second, forget about what your actual opinions are. If you were going into this unbiased, really with no opinion on it, and this was the fact you were presented with, does that sound like something that we should be embarking on as a country? My guess is that many of you are probably thinking no. Now let's consider this other statistic that was commonly presented by CNN, MSNBC, the other left-leaning stations. 30 million Americans have no access to health care. Again, I want you to think for a second, and I want you to try to be unbiased about this. I want you to think for a second, if that was the statistic you were presented with, Do you think that this was a program that we needed as a country, that we needed to pass this program, which was going to be potentially very costly, and that 30 million Americans have no access to health care? My guess is that you have a very different opinion on it now. When you hear that 90% of Americans have access to health care, and the government asks you whether you support a law that's going to cost you more money, my guess is that most of you think we shouldn't have done it. When you hear instead that 30 million Americans have no access to health care, and the government asks you about your opinion, whether you think this is something that we need to do, even though it's going to cost you potentially more money, my guess is that most of you think, yeah, this is something we needed to do. Two very different statistics, but did anybody lie? No. They capitalized on something I spoke about a few moments ago. The fact that we take our information in snippets, we absorb the news in snippets, and most of us, let's face it, we're busy. We're working, we're going to school, we have families, we have activities. We just take that information and we don't spend the time to really do additional research on it. News organizations know that. So here's the deal. Nobody lied. We have about 300 million Americans total. 90% of Americans did have access to health care. That's the equivalent of 270 million Americans. But there were still 30 million Americans without health care. That's the other 10%. So nobody lied. But they knew that if you were only watching one station, if you were only watching Fox News, or you were only watching CNN, MSNBC, they knew that if they presented you with that single statistic, that was going to be very influential in building your support for what they wanted. So your assignment for the next couple of days is to monitor the news organizations. And I really want you to go into this as unbiased as possible. I want you to pretend for a few days that you are an independent voter, that you don't lean to the left, that you don't lean to the right, that you're not a Trump supporter, you're not a Clinton supporter, you're not pro-gun, you're not anti-gun. I really want you to go into this as an independent voter. I want you to monitor both sides of the aisle. I want you to monitor Fox News, and I want you to monitor the liberal stations, the CNNs, the MSNBCs. You can do this either by watching TV, by watching the news stations, or you can do this using the print media. All of these organizations have apps. Some of you might actually have them on your phone already. All of these organizations have apps, and if you don't want to download an app, they all have websites. There's foxnews.com, cnn.com, msnbc.com. I want you to monitor them for evidence of bias. And again, I really want you to go in as an independent voter. So I'm hoping that you, regardless of whether you consider yourself Democrat or Republican, I'm hoping that at the end of this, you're going to see that both sides of the aisle are guilty of it. I want you to write up your results. I'm not a page-length grader, but I want you to pick a couple of issues, more than one, where you see evidence that the stations are using biased information to try to influence you. And here's the kind of things you want to look at. You want to look at what stories they're highlighting. And I'm guessing that if I went on to the apps right now, the top story on Fox News is different than the top story on CNN or MSNBC. So what stories are they highlighting as the big news, right? Fox News right now is probably highlighting some gotcha Hillary story as the top story, and CNN is probably highlighting some gotcha Trump as the top story. So what stories are they highlighting? If they are covering the same stories, how are they presenting them? What information are they sharing? How are they spinning it? I don't know if you remember, but about a week ago for the first presidential debate, Clinton brought up a former Miss Universe that Trump apparently had some interaction with, and he said some things about her that were not very nice. I think he called her fat. He said something, again, this was according to Hillary, but apparently he called her fat. He said something derogatory about her race. The very next day, when you looked at the news stations, the very next day, CNN doubled down on it. They highlighted a story that just really dug into Trump about how he was an awful person for doing this. And Fox News, on the other hand, their top story was a story about how this was not a very good woman to begin with. And apparently she had made death threats against somebody back in her home country. So, very different spin on the story. One supporting Trump and one not supporting Trump. So, if the news organizations are highlighting the same story or the same topic, how are they presenting it? What are they presenting? And then I also want you to look at the images, because images are very powerful, right? Sometimes we might not pay attention to the words, but we're paying attention to the picture that we see. So what kind of pictures are they showing? Are they showing pictures that make one person look favorable and another person look unattractive, for example? And also, don't neglect the headline, especially if you're looking at print media. Don't neglect the headline, because sometimes the headline is all you need to see that there's evidence of bias. Now, I've said a lot about Trump and Clinton because the presidential debate or the election is coming up. So I've said a lot about Trump and Clinton. You don't have to focus on Trump and Clinton. You don't have to focus on the presidential candidates. You can focus on anything. You can look at guns. You can look at abortion. You can look at race. You can look at immigration. You can look at social issues. You can look at anything that you want. It's totally up to you what kinds of things you want to look at. But I really, again, want you to be critical of both sides. Be critical of Fox News and be critical of the left-leaning stations as well. And I really believe that at the end of this, you're going to see evidence that both sides are guilty of this. And I hope that this makes you a more informed consumer of information moving forward. So enjoy, good luck, and sadly the media is biased, but I hope at the end of this you will realize it and again be better consumers of information.